Look at the photograph on your screen. A farmer and his wife standing in front of a plain white house, the way 10,000 couples posed in the 1800s. He has one hand resting on the back of a wooden chair. She has her hands folded at her waist, low and patient, the way women were told to hold them. Nothing about it should stop you. Nothing about it should keep you awake. And for more than 100 years, nobody thought it did. It sat in a shoebox, then a bureau drawer, then a county archive, filed under a name that later turned out to be wrong. Thousands of people walked past it. Not one of them looked closely at her neck, because if you look closely at her neck, at the thin pale line that runs from behind her ear down to her collarbone, the line that looks exactly like a seam where two separate things were pressed together and healed, you start to notice something. That same line appears in other photographs, on other women, in other towns, in other decades. Always the same line. Always the same place, just under the jaw, curving down to the shoulder. And the couples who carry it never seem to grow old. The wife in this picture is photographed as a young bride in 1859. She is photographed again in the same county in 1911. She does not look one day older. She is wearing the same faint line on her throat. This is the story of one photograph, one county that was there and then somehow was not, and a mark that somebody spent a very long time making sure you would never look at twice. Before we go one single step further, I want you to do something small for me. Pause the video, look at her neck, and type the first word that comes into your head down in the comments, just one word. Do not overthink it. Do not scroll to see what other people wrote. Just put down the word your gut hands you when you look at that line on her throat. I read those comments, and by the end of this video you are going to understand exactly why the word you just typed matters far more than you think it does. Now let me show you how this photograph actually reached me, and why the man who mailed it asked me, more than once, not to use his name. The photograph came to me inside a padded envelope with no return address, postmarked from a town I had never heard of and could not, at first, find on any modern map. Inside was the print itself, a cabinet card mounted on stiff board gone the colour of weak tea, and a single sheet of lined paper folded around it. The note said only this: "You people keep asking for the strange ones. This is the strangest one I have. Look at the woman. Do not stop looking until you understand." And then a line I have thought about every night since. My grandfather said she came with the house. I want to be honest with you about how I first reacted, because I think it is the same way you would react. I set the note aside. I get envelopes like this constantly. When you spend years looking into old photographs, into buried buildings and burned towns and the parts of history that do not sit right, people send you things. Most of them are nothing. A blurry face, a shadow that looks like a figure if you squint, a trick of old glass and old chemistry. So I almost filed the Harrow photograph with the rest of them. Almost. What stopped me was the paper the print was mounted on and the small pressed line of type running along the bottom edge of the board, the photographer's mark. It read, in faded serif letters, J. Calendar, Portraitist, Aldermore, Wexcombe County. And under that, a date, 1859. Now, that on its own means nothing to you. It meant nothing to me either for about a day. Aldermore is not a famous place. Wexcombe County is not somewhere you have driven through. But when I went looking for both of them, that is when the ordinary story of a farmer and his wife began to come apart in my hands. Because Aldermore is on the county surveys of 1855, it is on the postal route maps of 1860. It has a rail spur marked on a freight schedule from 1863, a grain depot, a Methodist church, a bank, and a population the census taker recorded in a careful sloping hand as 1,940 souls. And then, sometime in the 1870s, Aldermore stops. Not shrinks, not fades, stops. The next full county census does not list it at all. Not as a town, not as a ruin, not as a place that used to be there. It is simply gone from the record, as if the pen that had been writing its name for 20 years was suddenly taken away and told to write about something else. Towns die all the time, you might say. Rail lines move, the crops fail, the young people leave, and a place that had 2,000 people becomes a gas station and a grain elevator. That is true. That happens. But when a town dies that way, it leaves a body. It leaves a cemetery that keeps getting new stones for a while after. It leaves a newspaper that prints its last edition and says goodbye. It leaves land deeds that change hands, foreclosures, a bank that closes its doors on a specific Tuesday. Aldermore left none of that. There is no final newspaper. There is no last burial. There is a bank that, according to the state ledger, held deposits for 1,900 people one year and did not exist the next, with no record of a run, a robbery, a fire, or a transfer. The money is not moved. The money is just no longer being counted. I spent 3 weeks convinced I was simply looking in the wrong drawer. That is what a rational person does. You assume the fault is yours, that the records were misfiled, that a courthouse burned and took the paper with it, that the town was absorbed into a neighbour and renamed. So I looked for the neighbour. I looked for the fire. And here is where the woman with the line on her neck stopped being a curiosity and became something I could not put down. Because there was a fire. Aldermore did burn. In the autumn of 1871, according to a single surviving insurance notice held in a company archive 4 states away, a fire took, and I am quoting the notice exactly, the whole of the town excepting the church and the works, the whole of the town, 1,900 people. And there is no account of the dead, no mass grave, no list of names read aloud at a memorial, no relief fund, though relief funds were the fashion of the age, and every burned town in the country had one. A town of 2,000 people burned to the ground, and the country did not notice, and the county did not mourn, and the only paper that records it at all is a form filled out by a clerk who wanted to know whether a claim would be paid. And in the middle of all of this, mounted on tea-coloured board, dated 12 years before that fire, is a photograph of a farmer named Elias Harrow and his wife Cordelia, standing in front of a plain white house on the edge of that town, with a thin pale seam running down the side of her throat. I need you to hold 2 facts in your head at the same time, because the rest of this story lives in the space between them. The first fact is that Aldermore was real. It had a bank and a church and a rail spur and almost 2,000 people, and the paper proves it. The second fact is that Aldermore was erased thoroughly and quietly, in a way that towns are not usually erased, and the only reason we are talking about it at all is that one photograph slipped out of the county through a shoebox and a bureau drawer and landed in my mail. Everything I am about to tell you comes from the thread I pulled on that photograph. The couple, the house, the line on her neck, the other pictures, the works at Marrow Point that the fire spared, and the reason a man's grandfather would say, with a straight face, that the woman came with the house. Before we move on to the next photograph, stop for a second. What you just heard about the ring around her throat is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original archive scan. The healed seam, the wrong date. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Let me tell you who Elias and Cordelia Harrow were, or at least who the paper says they were, because even that turns out to be a strange kind of question. Elias Harrow appears in the Wexcombe County tax rolls beginning in 1848, listed as a holder of 160 acres north of the Aldermore rail spur, described as arable, with a dwelling, a barn, and a well. That is a completely ordinary entry. Thousands of men appear in county rolls exactly like that. What is not ordinary is that Elias Harrow appears in those same rolls, at the same address, holding the same 160 acres for the next 52 years, and his entry never changes. Not the acreage, not the description, not, and this is the part I keep returning to, the tax assessed against it. From 1848 to 1900, land values in that county tripled. Every farm around the Harrow place was reassessed, subdivided, mortgaged, sold, and reassessed again. The Harrow entry sits in the middle of all that churning paper like a stone in a river. Same acreage, same words, same number, as if the clerk who wrote it the first time simply copied it forward year after year, decade after decade, because nobody ever came to the courthouse to tell him anything had changed. Cordelia Harrow is harder to find, the way wives usually are in old records, present mostly as a shadow attached to a husband's name. But she is in the church register. She is listed as a communicant of the Aldermore Methodist Church in 1852, and she is listed again in the same register, in the same handwriting that does not appear to age any more than she does, in 1898. 46 years. And between those 2 dates she is not baptized, not married a second time, not buried, not moved to another congregation. She simply keeps appearing once a year, a name on a list, a woman who takes communion in a town that the rest of the country believes burned to nothing in 1871. Now think about what that means. The fire was in 1871. The insurance notice says the whole of the town was taken, excepting the church and the works. And here is Cordelia Harrow, still taking communion in that spared church 27 years after the town around it supposedly ceased to exist. Either the fire was not what the notice claimed, or the town did not end when we think it did, or Cordelia Harrow was one of a small number of people who stayed on in a place that everyone else had agreed to stop counting. And whichever of those three things is true, none of them is the story of an ordinary farmer's wife. I want to be careful here, because this is the point in a story like this where it becomes very easy to start seeing ghosts in every column of numbers. Records repeat, clerks are lazy, handwriting looks similar across decades because people were taught the same penmanship in the same schools. A skeptic could take everything I have just told you and give you a dull, reasonable explanation for each piece of it, and the skeptic would not be wrong to try. That is exactly what I did, for weeks sitting with these documents and arguing against myself, and every single time I ran into the same wall. The wall was the neck, because you can explain away a repeated tax entry, you can explain away a lazy church register. What you cannot explain away is the line on Cordelia Harrow's throat, appearing in a photograph from 1859 and then appearing again, in the same place, on the same woman, in a photograph taken in 1911, a full 52 years later, on a woman whose face has not moved a single year in either direction. So let me take you to the neck. Let me show you exactly what is there, and exactly what is not, and why the first photograph specialist I showed it to handed it back to me and asked me to leave. Here is what you see when you look at the 1859 cabinet card at ordinary size. A young woman, perhaps 22, perhaps 25, hard to say, with dark hair pulled back and parted in the centre, a high-collared dress buttoned nearly to the jaw, and a calm, closed expression that gives away nothing at all. Standard for the period. What draws your eye, once someone tells you to look, is a narrow gap at the top of that high collar, right below the ear, where the fabric does not quite meet the skin. And in that gap, running down and forward toward the hollow of the throat, is a line. Fine. Pale. Slightly raised, or so it appears, catching the studio light along one edge the way a healed scar catches light. If you saw it on a living person today, you would think without any drama at all that someone had once made an incision there and closed it cleanly. A surgical line, a seam. Except the 1859 photograph was taken in a farm town on the frontier, by a portrait photographer, in a decade when the kind of clean, closing, nearly invisible surgical work that line implies did not exist anywhere in the world. There was no procedure in 1859 that left a scar like that. Not on a farmer's wife, not on a queen. The medicine of the age closed wounds with heavy sutures and left ropey, puckered, obvious tracks, if the patient survived at all, which around the throat they very often did not. And yet there it is. A modern-looking line, decades before the medicine that could have made it, on the neck of a woman who does not age. I took the print to a man who restores and authenticates 19th century photographs for a living, a genuine expert, the sort of person museums call. I did not tell him what I thought. I did not say the word seam. I simply asked him to date the print and tell me anything unusual about it. He confirmed the process, confirmed the mount, confirmed the period, all of it consistent with 1859, no signs of tampering, no double exposure, no retouching of the plate. A genuine untouched image of that exact year. And then, without my saying anything, he put his loop down over the woman's throat, and he was quiet for a long time, and when he looked up his face had changed. He said, "That line is on the plate," meaning it was not added later, not painted on, not an artifact of the paper. It was there, on the woman when the shutter opened. He said, "Whatever that is, she had it the day this was taken." And then he asked me, in a careful voice, where I had gotten the photograph, and when I told him about the envelope and the note and the grandfather who said she came with the house, he gathered the print back into its sleeve, slid it across the table to me, and told me he thought it would be better if I took my work somewhere else. I have thought a great deal about why he reacted that way. He was not a superstitious man. He looks at dead people's faces all day. But I think what unsettled him was the same thing that unsettles me, and that will unsettle you before this is over. It is not that the line is frightening on its own. It is that the line is a piece of information. It is a mark that means something, that was put there on purpose, by someone for a reason, and once you accept that it is real and that it is old and that it repeats, you are forced to ask the only question that matters. Who marks people at the neck, and what are they marking them as? Once you know to look for the line, you cannot stop finding it. That is the part that broke the story open for me, and it is the part I most want you to understand, because a single strange photograph is a curiosity, and a curiosity is easy to dismiss. But a pattern is not a curiosity. A pattern is a fact about the world that is waiting for an explanation, and the line on Cordelia Harrow's throat is a pattern. The second photograph came from a completely different source, and that matters because it means no one could have coordinated the two. It surfaced in an online archive of estate photographs, uploaded by a dealer clearing out a house sale 2,000 miles from Wexcombe County, catalogued with the blunt indifference of a man who just wants the box gone. Elderly couple, the listing said, circa 1910. Unknown. I almost scrolled past it. What made me stop was the woman's hands. They were folded at her waist, low and patient, in the exact posture from the 1859 cabinet card. I told myself that meant nothing. Every woman of the period was told to stand that way. Then I enlarged the image, and I looked at her face, and I looked at her throat, and I felt the floor of the room tilt very slightly under me. It was her. Not a woman who resembled her, not a daughter who favoured her mother. Her. The same face, down to the particular set of the mouth and the particular distance between the eyes, a distance you cannot fake and cannot inherit exactly. The same dark hair, greyed now only at the temples, the only concession to time in the entire image. The same calm, closed, giving nothing expression. And running down from behind her ear, in the gap above a high lace collar 60 years out of fashion for a woman her supposed age, the same fine pale line, the same seam. 52 years after the first photograph, in a house on the other side of the continent, a woman who could not possibly be the same woman was standing in the same pose, wearing the same mark, and refusing to have aged. I want to say plainly what the ordinary explanations are, because I owe you that, and because I chased every one of them. Explanation 1. It is a coincidence, two unrelated women with a similar scar photographed in a similar pose. But faces do not match to the millimetre by coincidence, and I had the images measured point to point by someone who does facial comparison in courtrooms, and his report used the word indistinguishable, which is a word those people are professionally terrified of using. Explanation 2. It is a hoax. Someone made the second photograph to match the first. But the second photograph came from an estate sale catalogued by a man who had never heard of me, of Aldermore, or of the Harrow print, which was sitting in a sleeve in my desk and had never been published anywhere. There was no first image for a forger to copy. Explanation 3, and this is the one the rational part of my mind clung to longest. They are the same woman, and the 52 years is a mistake. One of the two dates is wrong. So I dated them both again, independently, by two separate experts who did not know about each other. 1859, 1911. Neither budged, which leaves you where it left me. Standing in front of two photographs taken 52 years apart of the same unaging woman wearing the same deliberate mark on her neck, and no honest way to explain it. And then there was a third, and a fourth, and once I started actively searching, sorting through thousands of anonymous 19th century portraits in a dozen archives, filtering for high collars and a particular posture and a gap of exposed throat, I found the line 11 more times. 11. Different women, this time not all the same face, spread across 4 decades and at least 6 states that I could confirm. A woman in a wedding portrait from 1864, a woman standing beside a well in 1879. A pair of sisters, or women dressed as sisters, in 1888, both marked, the lines mirror images of each other, one on the left of the throat and one on the right, as if they had been done by the same hand working across a table. And in almost every case, when I could trace the person at all, I ran into the same two features I had found with Cordelia Harrow. The record repeats without aging, and the town they came from is missing. That last part is what turned my stomach cold, so let me slow down and be precise about it. Of the 14 marked people I could eventually identify by name or by place, 9 came from towns that follow the Aldermore pattern exactly. A settlement that is fully documented, taxed, mapped, populated, sometimes for decades, and then a gap. A fire or a flood or simply a silence. after which the town is no longer counted, the people are no longer traced, and the survivors, when there are survivors in the record at all, are a small handful of names that keep reappearing for another 20 or 30 years in registers no one seems to be reading. Marked necks come from erased towns. That is the pattern. And the closer I looked at how those towns were erased, the less any of it looked like ordinary history, and the more it looked like something being cleaned. I want to take you now to the fire, because the fire is where the mudflood people and the buried building people and the reset people, the whole strange family of researchers this channel lives among, all start pointing at the same evidence from different directions. And for once, I think they are pointing at something real. Aldermore burned in the autumn of 1871. That is the one fact everyone agrees on because of the insurance notice. The whole of the town, excepting the church and the works, now a fire that takes a whole town of 1,900 people, is one of the largest disasters that can befall a 19th century community. It should generate paper the way a wound generates blood. Casualty lists, relief committees, newspaper coverage for 100 miles in every direction, because a burning town was the most reliable front-page story of the age. Rebuilding contracts, lumber orders, insurance claims by the hundreds, letters, diaries, grief. And Aldermore's fire generated one form, filled out by one clerk, 4 states away. But that is not even the strangest part. The strangest part is what happened next. Because Aldermore was not abandoned after the fire. It was rebuilt. We know this because the church register keeps running. We know it because Cordelia Harrow keeps taking communion. We know it because there is a photograph, and I will describe it to you exactly, of the Aldermore Main Street taken in 1874, 3 years after the town supposedly burned to nothing, showing a full block of brick commercial buildings, 2 stories, ornate cornices, arched windows, cast-iron storefronts, the kind of buildings that in any other town took a generation of accumulating wealth to raise. 3 years. From ash to a street of finished masonry that looks, if I am honest with you, older and grander than the wooden town that supposedly stood there before the fire. Where did the money come from? Where did the labour come from in a town whose entire population had just burned or fled? Where did the brick come from, and the iron and the skilled masons who cut those cornices in 3 years on a frontier for a town nobody was writing about? And here is the question the buried building researchers ask, and I have stopped being able to laugh at it. What if the grand brick town was not built after the fire at all? What if it was already there? What if it had always been there, under or behind or beneath the wooden frontier town, and the fire did not destroy Aldermore so much as it burned away the flimsy, temporary, explainable version of Aldermore that had been sitting in front of the real one, and left the real one exposed? And what if the reason there are no casualty lists, no relief funds, no grief, is that the fire was not a tragedy that happened to the town? What if it was a procedure that was done to it? The insurance notice spared 2 things from the fire: the church and the works. The church we can find. It is on the maps, it is in the register, it is the building where Cordelia Harrow kept appearing for decades. But the works are never described. Not in the notice, not in the tax rolls, not on any map of Aldermore that I have been able to lay my hands on. A word used once, in passing, as if everyone reading the form already knew exactly what the works were, and no one needed to explain them. And that word sent me to Marrow Point. Marrow Point is a bluff of high ground about 2 miles north of where Aldermore stood, above a bend in the river, and it is the only feature in the whole county that appears on the old maps under a name that was never explained and never changed. On the survey of 1855, before the town, before the rail spur, before Elias Harrow's 160 acres, Marrow Point is already drawn with a symbol I did not recognise. Not a house, not a mill, not a fort in the military sense the army would have used, a shape with points, an 8-pointed star drawn in careful ink sitting on the bluff above the river, labelled only with the surveyor's abbreviation for a structure, and the word works. If you have spent any time at all in this corner of research, your skin just went cold, because you know what an 8-pointed star on high ground next to water is. You have seen them in 100 videos, the star forts. The bastion forts, the official story tells us, geometric defensive works built across the entire world, on every continent in wild frontier places that had nothing to defend and no one to defend it from. in numbers and to a standard of engineering that the settlers who supposedly built them could not possibly have achieved with the tools and the manpower the same history says they had. The star forts that sit under modern cities, that turn up half buried, that are always described in the records as older than the town around them, predating the people who supposedly raised them. And here was one, drawn on a bluff above Aldermore in 1855, already there, already named, labelled with the one word the fire would later spare. I went to Marrow Point. I want to tell you I found a star fort. I did not. What I found was more unsettling than a ruin. I found a bluff of high ground above a bend in a river that had been graded flat, not eroded, not overgrown, graded, levelled with a precision that recent earth-moving leaves behind, the ground scraped and rolled and seeded over, ringed by a fence with no gate I could find, and a sign, weathered but modern, that named a soil conservation district I could locate in no state directory. Someone had taken an 8-pointed structure that stood on that bluff for at least a century and a half, and they had, within living memory, erased it as thoroughly as the county had erased the town below it. The same hand, the same method. Something is real, something is documented, something is there, and then quietly, with no announcement and no ceremony, it is not, and the ground is smoothed over and a sign is put up and you are invited to keep driving. Let me connect the pieces I have laid down, because at this point the picture starts to assemble itself whether you want it to or not. A town appears fully formed with grand masonry that does not match its supposed age or wealth. A star fort older than the town sits on the high ground above it. The town is populated for a generation, and then it burns in a fire that leaves no grief and no bodies, and it is rebuilt in 3 impossible years, or perhaps merely uncovered. The people who remain do not age, they carry a mark on their necks, and when a modern researcher goes looking, the fort is graded flat, and the town is scrubbed from the record, and a man mails a photograph out of the county in a padded envelope with no return address, and asks you not to use his name. Each of those facts alone has a boring explanation. Together they describe something that has no boring explanation at all. So let me tell you the theory that the people who sent me down this road believe, and then let me tell you the part of it I cannot make myself to dismiss. They believe there was a civilization here before the one we are taught about. Not a lost tribe, not a vanished kingdom in the ordinary sense, but a coherent, advanced, worldwide order whose architecture is the architecture we now call too grand for its age, whose forts are the star forts, whose cities are the impossibly beautiful buildings in the old photographs that we are told were thrown up in a season for a World's Fair and then torn down. They believe that this order was ended deliberately in a series of events across the 1800s, wars that do not quite add up, fairs that built entire white cities and then demolished them, fires that took whole towns and left no grief, floods of mud that buried the first stories of buildings all over the world, so that today we walk into 150-year-old structures through windows that used to be doors, a great erasing, a reset, and afterward a new population moved in, told a new story, and taught to believe the grand old buildings were theirs, that their own grandparents had raised them, that nothing had been taken and nothing had been replaced. And in that theory, the orphans are the part that will not let me sleep, because there is a documented thing, a real thing, that happened in the exact decades of the supposed reset that mainstream history records openly and treats as an ordinary if sad chapter of the age. The orphan trains. Between the 1850s and the early 1900s, something on the order of 200,000 children, and I am spelling that out because it is not a small number, 200,000 children, were gathered up, largely from a handful of eastern cities, loaded onto trains and distributed across the interior of the continent to families who took them in. That is the official account, and the official account frames it as charity, as a solution to urban poverty, as well-meaning people finding homes for the abandoned young. Perhaps it was exactly that. But sit with the shape of it for a moment, next to everything else I have told you. In the same decades that towns are burning without grief and forts are being buried and a new story is being written over an old one, a continent is quietly repopulated with hundreds of thousands of children who have no verifiable past, no traceable parents, no memory anyone can check, delivered by rail into the interior and handed to whoever would take them. Where did all those children actually come from? We are told they came from the slums of the eastern cities. But the numbers the reformers themselves recorded do not cleanly account for the numbers the reformers themselves shipped. And a child of 3 or 4, delivered by train to a farm town in the interior, remembers nothing of where it came from. It grows up believing it was always here. It grows up believing the grand brick town on Main Street was built by people like itself in the ordinary course of time, because that is what the grown-ups around it, who also arrived by train, also believe. A whole generation raised with a past that was handed to them at a railway platform. And who would be raising them? Who would be waiting on those platforms? Who would be the calm, unaging faces in the farm town, standing in front of plain white houses, folding their hands low and patient at their waists, keeping the old buildings warm and the old story quiet until the new children were grown enough to inherit a world that had been prepared for them and cleaned of its former owners? I told you the church register carried Cordelia Harrow to 1898. I did not tell you where it carried her after that, because after that the register does something it has never done in all its decades of quietly listing her name. It stops listing her, and it says why. In the entries for the spring of 1899, in that same unaging hand, there is a note beside her name, removed to the county home. And that is the last the church has to say about her. The county home is what a gentler age called an asylum. And here the paper trail, which has been so thin and so strange for so long, suddenly becomes thick and specific and clinical, and I almost wish it had not, because the intake record for the county home has survived, and Cordelia Harrow is in it, and reading it is the closest I have come in this entire investigation to wanting to stop. She was admitted, the record says, at the request of persons unnamed. Her age is given as a question mark. An actual drawn question mark in the column where a number should be, as if the clerk asked and could not get an answer that made sense and gave up. Under the heading for distinguishing marks, the clerk wrote one line: cicatrix at the throat, old, of no known origin, which the patient will not permit to be examined. Cicatrix is the medical word for scar. Old, of no known origin, which the patient will not permit to be examined. A woman who by the county's own math should have been dead for 2 generations, admitted to an asylum at the request of persons unnamed, guarding the mark on her throat from the hands of the men who wanted to look at it. And the last line of her intake, the line I have read more times than is good for me, is a note in a different ink, added later, that says only, discharged, to Marrow Point, to the works, to the graded flat bluff with no gate. Cordelia Harrow, or whatever we should call the woman in the photograph, spent 40 years standing in front of a plain white house in a town that had been erased around her, keeping her hands folded and her collar high and her mark hidden. And when at last someone decided she was finished, she was not buried, and she was not freed. She was discharged to the Star Fort, and there the record of her ends, the way the record of everything in this story ends, at Marrow Point, at the works, at the one place the fire was told to spare, and the modern world was careful to grade flat. Now I have to tell you about the other people who were discharged to Marrow Point, because Cordelia was not the only one. Once I had the county home records, I read all of them, every intake for 40 years, and I found the phrase again and again, discharged to Marrow Point, discharged to the works. And every single time, without one exception, the person discharged there had the same entry under distinguishing marks: cicatrix at the throat, old, of no known origin. The asylum was not a place where the marked people were kept. It was a place where they were held between one thing and another, a waiting room. And the door at the far end of that waiting room opened onto the Star Fort, and no one who went through it is recorded as ever coming back. So what is the mark? I have circled it for this whole story, and I owe you my best answer, even though my best answer is a question with the ground taken out from under it. The mark is a seam at the throat, old, of no known origin, worn by unaging people who come from erased towns and are, at the end, delivered to the works. And I can tell you the 2 thoughts I cannot get to stop fighting each other in my head. The first thought is that the seam is where something was put in, that these people were altered given whatever it is that stops the aging, and the line on the throat is the closing scar of that alteration, and the reason they guard it, the reason Cordelia would not let the asylum doctors look, is that the mark is the proof of what was done to them. The second thought is worse, and it is the one the grandfather's note keeps pushing me toward. She came with the house. Not she lived in the house, not she owned the house, she came with it, like a fixture, like a part of the property that transfers with the deed, and if that is the right way to read it, then the seam at the throat is not where something was put in, it is where something was joined. It is the line where a made thing was finished, the way a doll has a seam where the head meets the body, and the unaging faces in the plain white houses were not survivors of the old world at all. They were caretakers, manufactured, marked, set in place to keep the grand old buildings warm and the old story quiet, and sent back to the works when the orphans were grown and the caretakers were no longer needed. I do not know which thought is true. I want to be honest with you about that, because the people who make videos like this too often pretend to certainty they have not earned, and I am not going to insult you that way. I do not know what Cordelia Harrow was. I know what the paper says, and the paper says she took communion for 46 years without aging, guarded a scar of no known origin, and was discharged at the end to a star fort that has since been graded flat. Everything past that is the space between the facts, and you are as entitled to stand in that space as I am. But there is one more piece, and it is the piece that made me finally sit down and make this, after months of telling myself it was too thin, too strange, too easy to laugh at. It is the reason the man mailed me the photograph, and it is the reason he asked me not to use his name, because the photograph did not come from an archive, it did not come from an estate sale. The man who sent it to me is not a collector or a historian. He is, by his own account, in a second letter he sent, after I wrote back to him, the current owner of the Harrow place, the 160 acres north of where the Aldermore rail spur used to run. He bought the land, he told me 11 years ago, at a price that should have made him suspicious, from a seller he only ever dealt with through a lawyer. The plain white house in the photograph is still standing on it. He lives in it. And when he moved in, the photograph of Elias and Cordelia Harrow was already there, hung in the front hall in a frame screwed to the wall, and the deed he signed, he swears to me, contained a clause he did not understand at the time and has thought about every day since. The photograph was not to be removed from the house. It conveyed with the property. It came with the house. The way his grandfather had always told him about the woman in it, she came with the house. His grandfather is the reason any of this reached you, so let me give you the grandfather's story the way it was given to me, because it is the human centre of a thing that otherwise stays cold and clinical and easy to hold at arm's length. The grandfather had grown up in that county, in the years when it still remembered having been more than empty fields. And the thing the grandfather always said, the thing the family treated as an old man's story, was that when he was a boy there were still a few of the old people around. That is how he described them. The old people. Not old in years, he would insist. That was the whole strange point of it. They did not look old at all. They looked the way they had always looked. But everyone in the county under a certain age understood that they were old in some other way, that they had been here before, that they belonged to the town the way the Star Fort and the brick buildings belonged to it from before. The children were warned not to bother them. And the old people kept to their houses, and folded their hands, and wore their collars high, and every so often one of them would be taken up to the works and would not be seen again. And no one, the grandfather said, no one ever asked why, because asking why was simply not a thing that was done. And then, the grandfather said, sometime in his own boyhood, they finished, all at once, or near enough. Within a few years, the last of the old people were taken up to Marrow Point, and the county quieted in a way he could never quite describe, and the outside world, which had never paid Aldermore much attention, stopped paying it any at all. The maps changed, the name came off, and the children who had been warned away from the old people grew up and had children of their own who never knew there had been old people to be warned away from, and the whole thing sank gently, the way a stone sinks into a pond that closes over it without a scar. The grandfather was one of the last who remembered. He hung on to the one photograph he had of Elias and Cordelia in front of the plain white house, and he told his grandson the one sentence he could never let go of: she came with the house. And when the grandson finally sold up and moved away, and later heard that a man on the internet was collecting the strange photographs, the impossible towns, the buried buildings, he found the print in a box and he mailed it to me. And he asked me not to use his name, because his grandfather had also always said one other thing, that the works were not empty. That being graded flat did not mean being gone, and that the surest way to be taken up to Marrow Point was to be a person who had started asking where the old people went. I sat with that letter for a long time, and then I did the thing the letter warned me not to do. I went looking for the people who had asked before me, because I could not be the first. A pattern this large marked necks across 6 states, erased towns, buried forts, a documented orphan migration of 200,000 children. None of that stays hidden because it is hard to see. A great deal of it is sitting in plain view, in public archives, in insurance forms and church registers and asylum intakes that anyone can read. It stays hidden because of what happens to the people who assemble it. So, I went looking for my predecessors and I found them, and finding them is the last thing I'm going to tell you before I let you go back to your life and your ordinary photographs. There was a county historian decades ago who wrote a short monograph on the vanished towns of the interior, a dry academic thing, self-published, a few hundred copies. In it, in a single paragraph, he notes the Aldermore fire, the missing casualty lists, and, in the phrase I read 4 times to be sure of, the peculiar longevity of certain of the surviving communicants. That historian is listed on the monograph. He has a name, a university, a department, and he has nothing else, no other publications, no obituary, no record of retirement, of death, of a life that continued after that little book came out. He simply ends, the way the town ends, the way Cordelia ends, mid-sentence, with the ground smoothed over behind him. There was an amateur photographer in the 1960s who, according to a surviving letter he wrote to a collector, had assembled what he called a study of the throat-marked portraits, dozens of them gathered from estate sales across the interior, all bearing the same seam, all refusing to age across the images he could sequence. He was going to publish it. He wrote that he had found, and I am quoting the letter, the register that lists them, the place they are kept, and the day they are called back. He never published it. The collection is not in any archive. The letter survives only because the collector he wrote to kept it, and the collector, when contacted years later, said the photographer had stopped answering his mail, and that when he had driven out to the address to check on him, there had been a house, and a graded lot beside it, and a neighbour who said the man had moved away suddenly and left the photographs behind, and that when the collector asked to see the photographs, the neighbour said they had already been collected. By whom? The collector asked, and the neighbour said, the people from the works. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that I have just told you a ghost story with the lights off, and that the responsible thing, the thing a careful person does, is to note that letters can lie, and neighbours can misremember, and self-published historians can simply quit and vanish into private life for 100 boring reasons. All of that is true. I hold all of it in one hand. And in the other hand I hold a photograph dated 1859 of an unaging woman with a surgical seam that the medicine of her age could not have made, matched to the millimetre to a second photograph from 1911, both of them traced to a town that burned without grief and rebuilt in 3 impossible years beneath a star fort that has since been quietly graded flat, and I hold the asylum record that discharged her, and 13 others just like her, to that fort, and I hold a deed with a clause that says the picture of her may not be taken down, and when I weigh the 2 hands against each other I cannot make the careful explanations outweigh the seam. There is one detail in the 1859 photograph I have saved for now, because it only means something once you know everything else, and because it is the detail that finally convinced me the buried building people are not chasing shadows. Look again at the plain white house behind Elias and Cordelia Harrow. Look at the ground line where the house meets the earth. Look at the windows on the lowest visible story. They are wrong, not dramatically, not in a way you would notice if no one told you, but the windows at the base of that house sit too low. Their tops are at the height where the middle of a window should be, and their bottoms disappear below the grade of the yard, into the soil, as if the ground has come part way up the wall of the house, or as if the house was set down into ground that was already too high for it. It is the single most common feature in the entire body of buried building photographs, the sunken lowest story, the window that has become a half window, the door you now step down to reach. And here it is in 1859 in the yard of the Harrow place, decades before anyone coined a word for what it is. The man who owns the house now confirmed it for me without my asking, in his second letter, because he had noticed it too, living there. The house has a lower story, he wrote, that you reach by going down. The windows of it are below the yard. When he had drainage work done, the crews found the original ground level, the true one, a good few feet below the grass, and found the bottom of those low windows down there in the dark, still glazed, still whole, looking out at packed earth. The house had not settled. The world around the house had come up. Something had raised the ground all at once by the look of it, packed a few feet of earth against the walls of a standing house and every other house in a standing town, and then a new town had been built at the new level, and a new story had been told, and the old lowest story had been left to the dark with its windows looking out at nothing. A flood of mud, in the yard of a farmer and his wife, under the feet of an unaging woman with a seam at her throat. So here is where the whole thing arrives, and I am going to say it as plainly as I am able, and then I am going to leave the rest to you, because it is genuinely yours to decide. What if the ordinary version of the 1800s is a lid, a clean, well-lit, thoroughly documented lid, resting on top of something else? Under the lid there was a world of grand buildings and star forts, and a knowledge of things we no longer have, including perhaps whatever it is that stops a face from aging. That world was ended, not in a single day, but across a long and deliberate century, by fires that took towns without grief, and floods of mud that raised the ground over the lowest stories, and wars whose numbers do not add up, and fairs that built white cities and tore them down. And the people of that world were not all simply killed. Some were kept, marked at the throat, set in the surviving houses, made to fold their hands and keep their collars high and hold the old buildings warm and the old story quiet, while a new population, gathered as children off trains from somewhere no one can quite account for, grew up believing the grand old world was theirs, was ordinary, was always exactly what they had been told. And when the handover was complete, when the new people were grown and the story was set, the marked caretakers were called back one by one to the works, and the works were graded flat, and a photograph slipped out of the county in a padded envelope because one old man at the end of a long life could not stop hearing his grandfather say, "She came with the house." The photographer from the 1960s, the one who ended mid-sentence, wrote one line I have not been able to put down. He said he had found the register that lists them, the place they are kept, and the day they are called back. A register, a list with dates. And for a long time I treated that as the raving of a man who had stared at too many dead faces, until I remembered where I had already seen exactly that kind of paper, and had not understood what I was looking at. The freight schedule. The one from 1863 that proved Aldermore had a rail spur. I had used it to establish that the town was real, glanced at the top line, and filed it. I went back and I read the whole thing, every entry, and I understood, sitting there, that I had been holding a piece of the register the entire time. A freight schedule lists what is shipped, when and to where, grain out, coal in, lumber, dry goods, the ordinary blood of a farm town. And threaded through the Aldermore schedule, a handful of times a year, is a shipment that has no weight listed, no commodity listed, and a destination that is not the depot and not the railhead, but two words I now could not read without my hands going cold. To works, not freight to the works, not supplies for the works, just in the destination column where every other line names a place a barrel of flour is going, those two words, to works. And in the column beside it, where a weight in hundredweight should be, a single number each time. 1, 2, once in the winter of 1870 the number 3, as if what was being shipped up to the Star Fort on the bluff a few times a year, quietly on the same rail that carried the county's grain, was not measured in pounds, it was measured in people. I counted them. Across the years the freight schedule survived, for from the late 1850s to the middle 1870s, the number in that column added together comes to a little over 200. 200 and some, shipped up to the works 1 and 2 and occasionally 3 at a time, over roughly 20 years. And here is the thing that put the freight schedule and the asylum record together into one single object. In my mind, one register in two halves. The county home intakes with the cicatrix at the throat, the ones discharged to Marrow Point, begin in the 1890s after the freight shipments stop. First the people are shipped up to the works, then decades later a different set of people is discharged up to the works. The direction is the same, the destination is the same. Only the paper changes from a freight column that measures its cargo in 1s and 2s to an asylum ledger that measures the same traffic in names and drawn question marks where an age should be. The register the photographer swore he found was never a single hidden document. It was the ordinary paper of an ordinary county, read in the right order, with the right thing understood about what the works were for. Let me give you one of the 200, because a number that size goes numb in the mouth and a person does not. In the freight schedule for the spring of 1866, there is a line to works cargo 1, and beside it, unusually, a name, written small, as if the clerk had been told not to, and did it anyway. Aldous. And Aldous, it turns out, is a name I already had, because one of the 14 marked faces I traced, the woman standing beside a well in 1879, 20 years younger in the photograph than she should have been, was identified in the estate listing that carried her image by a single surviving caption on the back of the print. Mrs. Aldous. The same name. A woman shipped up to the works cargo 1 in 1866, standing at a well, unedged, in a photograph from 1879, 13 years later, marked at the throat, shipped up, and then apparently standing in a yard again, on the far side of it, whatever it is, in, and out, and the seam at the throat in between. That is when I stopped being able to hold the first of my two thoughts, the gentle one, the one where the mark is just a scar from something done to living people. Because living people who are shipped up to a fort do not come back down younger. The freight schedule does not describe a medical procedure. It describes a cycle. Something goes up to the work, something comes back, and the something that comes back wears a seam at its throat and folds its hands and does not age, and stands in the yards of the plain white houses, patient until the schedule needs it again. There was a physician at the county home in Cordelia's years there, and he left behind a small clinical notebook that survives in a medical historical collection, valued for its ordinary detail, its notes on grip and childbed fever and the everyday griefs of a rural asylum. And in that notebook, buried among the fevers, are 3 pages about a class of patient he calls, with the doctor's careful distance, the incurables of long residence. He is puzzled by them. He writes that they do not sicken and do not mend, that they take no interest in release, that they eat little and sleep little and sit through the days with their hands folded, and that each of them bears at the throat an old cicatrix which none will permit him to examine, and which, in the one case where he was able to observe it during a patient's sleep, appeared to him, and I am quoting the notebook word for word, not the scar of a wound, but the join of a seam, regular, without inflammation, as though the flesh had been made in 2 parts and closed, as though the flesh had been made. A physician in the 1890s, not a conspiracy researcher, not a man with a channel and a theory, writing privately in his own notebook for no eyes but his own, arrived at the second of my 2 thoughts, the worst one, from nothing but a loop and a sleeping patient and 40 years of medicine. The flesh had been made in 2 parts and closed, and he did not know what to do with that any more than I do, so he wrote it down and turned the page and went back to the grip, because it was the 1890s and there was nothing else a reasonable man could do. The Star Fort itself I want to return to for a moment, because I have called it a fort out of habit, and the habit is wrong, and the wrongness matters. A fort is for defence. A fort has walls that face outward toward an enemy, and everything about its geometry is arranged to keep a thing out. But the Star Forts, all of them everywhere, share a feature that never made sense under the defence story, and makes perfect sense under this one. Their geometry works as well facing in as facing out. An 8-pointed star, bastions at every point, sightlines that cover every approach, is not only the perfect shape for keeping an army from getting in, it is the perfect shape for keeping anything from getting out, for watching a centre from every angle at once, for a place whose purpose is to hold something and observe it and permit nothing at its heart to slip past unseen. We were told the Star Forts were the height of a science of war. I think they were the height of a science of keeping. And the thing they were built to keep was not gold, and not grain, and not the town. It was the people who came with the houses. The number is the last thing, and then I will let the story close. 8 points on the star at Marrow Point. 14 marked faces I have been able to trace. 200 and some shipped to the works across 20 years. Those numbers do not obviously rhyme, and I distrust people who force numbers to rhyme, so I am not going to pretend they form a code. But there is one number that will not leave me alone. The population of Aldermore, recorded by the census taker in his careful sloping hand, was 1,940 souls. And when I finally sat down and counted across every register and roll and schedule and intake I had gathered, every single individual person named in the documents of that town across its entire 50-year existence, every farmer and wife and communicant and freight consignment and asylum patient, the count of unique human beings I could actually put a name to, came to a little under 300. 300 names, cycling, reappearing, shipped up and standing again, marked and unaging across 50 years and 1900 supposed souls. The town was recorded as having 2,000 people. The paper only ever describes about 300. And I no longer think the other 1,700 were people the records simply missed. I think the census taker counted the houses, and counted the story, and counted the number the town was supposed to have, and wrote it down in his careful hand, because that was his job, and the 300 marked and cycling caretakers kept the houses warm and the collars high so that anyone counting from the road would count a living town of 2,000 and never once have cause to knock on a door and find out how few of them there truly were. That is the shape of it. A town of 300 wearing the clothes of a town of 2,000, tending a grand old world it had not built under a star fort designed to keep its own heart from slipping out, on ground raised a few feet over the drowned lowest stories of the world before, waiting, folding its hands, until the trains had finished bringing the children who would inherit the disguise and believe it was a life. I have not told you everything the owner wrote to me, because some of it I sat on for a long time, unsure whether it belonged in a careful account or whether it was just a frightened man in an old house at night. But I have decided you should have it, because you have come this far with me, and because a careful account that leaves out the frightening parts to protect its own credibility is not careful, it is cowardly. So here is what the owner told me about living in the house where Cordelia Harrow came with the property. He told me the photograph will not stay level. He hangs it straight, screwed to the wall as the deed requires, and within a day or two it has tilted, always the same way, the woman's side dropping, so that if you follow the line of the frame it points down and to the north, toward the bluff, toward Marrow Point. He told me the lower story, the sunken one you reach by going down, stays a few degrees colder than the thermometer says it should, in every season, and that the drainage crew who found the old buried windows would not go back down after the first day and would not tell him why. He told me that his dog, an ordinary and cheerful animal, will not enter the front hall where the photograph hangs, and stands at the edge of the room with its ears back, watching a point on the wall that is not quite the photograph, a point a little to the left of it, at about the height, he wrote, of a person's throat. And he told me that once, in his second year in the house, he decided he had had enough of the claws and the tilting and the cold, and he took the photograph down, unscrewed it from the wall, wrapped it in a towel, and put it in the trunk of his car to drive it to the county seat and be rid of it. He got about 2 miles down the road to the turn where the old rail spur used to cross, and his car simply stopped. Not a dramatic failure, no smoke, no bang. It stopped the way a thing stops when it is switched off, and would not start, and sat there dead on the shoulder until he took the photograph out of the trunk and carried it back toward the house on foot, at which point he swears to me he heard the engine turn over behind him on the empty road, by itself, idling, waiting for him to come back and drive it home. He hung the picture back on the wall. It has not left the house since. He mailed me a print he made of it, a copy, and he wrote at the bottom of his letter that he suspected the copy was allowed to leave because the original never can. The original came with the house, the way she did. Now, believe as much of that as you choose. I have given it to you exactly as it was given to me, no more solid than one man's word, and one man's word is a thin thing, but hold it beside the second couple, because the second couple is not one man's word. The second couple is paper, the Mirror sisters, I called them earlier, the 2 marked women in the 1888 portrait. One seam on the left of the throat and one on the right. Done, I said, as if by the same hand working across the table. I traced them. It took months because they came from a different erased town 400 miles from Aldermore, a place called Verin that follows the pattern so exactly it is almost a copy, documented for a generation. A bank, a church, a rail spur, a recorded population of just over 2,000. A star fort on high ground above water, drawn on the survey before the town, labelled with the surveyor's shorthand and one plain word. And then a flood, this time an actual flood of the river in the spring of 1883, that took, the one surviving notice says, the whole of the town excepting the church and the works. The same sentence. 400 miles away and 12 years later, the whole of the town excepting the church and the works. not a paraphrase, not a coincidence of phrasing, the identical clause as though both notices were filled out from the same instruction sheet by people who had been told exactly which two things do not burn and do not drown, because those two things are not part of the town. They are the machinery the town is built to hide. And the two sisters of Verin appear in the Verin church register, taking communion unaging for 30 years after their town supposedly went under the river. And they are discharged at the end, both of them, on the same day in the same hand, to the works. To Verin's own star fort, its own graded, fenced, gateless bluff, which I have stood below and which wears the same modern sign for the same soil conservation district that appears in no state directory, 400 miles from the identical sign above Aldermore. The same authority manages both flattened forts, the same phantom district, the same erased towns, the same seam, the same folded hands, the same words spared from the same disaster, written in the same clause, and it is at this point, standing below the second fort reading the second impossible sign, that I understood this was never about Aldermore at all. Aldermore was one node, Verin was another, and a soil conservation district that does not exist in any directory owns the ground on top of both of them, and I do not want to think about how many more nodes that same phantom authority quietly holds the deeds to, above how many more drowned lowest stories, behind how many more fences with no gate. I built a map. I am not going to show it to you in full, not yet, not in this video, because it is not finished, and because I have watched what happens to the men who assemble these things and then publish them all at once, and alone. But I will tell you that it has more than 30 points on it now. More than 30 towns that follow the pattern. Documented, populated, then a fire or a flood that spares the church and the works, then a rebuilt or uncovered grandeur no one can afford. Then decades of unaging communicants who are discharged at the last up to a star fort that is later graded flat and fenced and signed over to a district that is not real. 30 points, and every one of them with a plain white house somewhere on its edge, and in the front hall of at least one of them, screwed to the wall by the terms of a deed, a photograph of a farmer and his wife that tilts always toward the bluff. One of those 30 points is a city you have heard of. I am not going to name it in this video for the same reason I will not show the full map, but it is not a vanished frontier settlement. It is a place with millions of people and an airport and a skyline, and it grew, according to the ordinary history, out of a muddy river town that burned in the 1800s and rebuilt itself in a handful of years into rows of grand stone buildings whose lowest stories you now enter by going down a short flight of steps from a sidewalk that sits higher than the doors were built for. It has a star fort in its founding maps on the high ground older than the town since built over, and in its oldest cemetery there is a section, walled off, of graves with no death dates, only a name and a single word where the year should be. Removed. If the pattern is real, and I have shown you why I can no longer believe it is not, then the pattern did not stay in the erased places. It scaled. The plain white farmhouse on the edge of Aldermore and the tower of glass you can see from a highway are the same objects at two sizes, both raised over a drowned floor, both tending a grandeur they did not build, both with their quiet caretakers folded and waiting somewhere out of the light. The only difference is that in the city no one has to warn the children away from the old people, because in the city there are too many faces for anyone to notice the few that never change, standing patient at the edges of the frame, collars high, hands low, marked at the throat, waiting to be called back up to a bluff that has since become a park. I told you at the start that the word you typed in the comments would matter more than you think. Here is why. I have read tens of thousands of those words now on the earlier, smaller videos I made while I was still chasing this, and they are not random. When people look at Cordelia Harrow's throat before they know anything, before I have told them a single thing about towns or forts or trains, the words they reach for cluster. Seam, wrong, joined, made, doll. Old, but people mean it strangely. They mean old the way the grandfather meant it, not old in years. And again, more than any other word from people who cannot explain why they wrote it. A single word. Waiting. They look at a woman standing in a yard in 1859, hands folded low and patient at her waist, and the word their gut hands them is waiting. Scroll up. Look at the word you wrote before you knew any of this. And ask yourself where it came from and how you knew, because I do not think we forget the reset. I think the reset was done to the record, to the maps, to the paper, to the towns and the forts and the ground itself. But I do not think it was ever quite done to us. I think there is a part of every person watching this that recognizes the seam at the throat and the low sunken windows and the hands folded in patient waiting. Recognizes them the way you recognize a room from a dream you cannot place. And I think that recognition is the last thing they could not grade flat. It is why videos like this find you. It is why the word comes up from somewhere older than your reasons for it. It is why a farmer and his wife, in a photograph so ordinary that thousands of people filed it and walked past it, can stop you cold once you finally look at her neck. I'm going to keep pulling this thread because I do not know how not to. There are 13 other marked faces I have not finished tracing. There are county homes in 5 states with intake records I have not yet read. There is a graded lot on a bluff above a bend in a river, behind a fence with no gate I could find, and a sign for a soil district that appears in no state directory, and I have not yet decided whether I am brave enough or stupid enough to go back to it. But I am not going to do the next part alone and quiet, the way the historian did, and the photographer did, the 2 men who assembled this before me, and then ended mid-sentence with the ground smoothed over behind them. I am going to do it in the open, with all of you watching, because the one thing the works has never had to deal with, in all its long and patient career of calling people back, is 100,000 pairs of eyes that already know the pattern and are waiting to see who stops appearing next. So this is what I am asking of you, and it is the only thing I am asking, because a confused mind takes no action, and I want you to take exactly 1. Do not like this video and forget it by dinner. Do not share it and move on. Watch the one that is coming up on your screen right now. The one where I lay the 14 marked faces side by side and show you the register the 1960s photographer swore he had found, the list of who is kept and where, and the day they are called back. Watch that one next right now while the pattern is fresh and your gut is still holding the word it handed you. Because the moment you see all 14 of them together in one place at one time, you are going to understand that this was never a story about one farmer and his wife. It was a story about how many of them there are, and about how you already knew, the second you looked at her neck, that she was not waiting for a photograph to be taken. She was waiting to be called back. Look at her one more time, then click the next one. I will be there.